Okay, welcome everybody to this very last minute roundtable panel entitled Initial Reflections on the 2022 Convoy Protests, Religion and Public Life in Practice. I'm going to be serving as the MC and moderator for this event. So the way that it's going to work is that we're primarily going to be using the QA function for asking questions. So if you have any questions, you can type them in there. If there are multiple questions dealing with the same subject matter, I'll try to synthesize them together. And yeah, I hope it leads to a fascinating and productive discussion. So the goal of this event is to see religion and public life as a discipline in practice, and to hope to demonstrate why the disciplined analysis of religious phenomena, or the religious elements of secular phenomena, matter when we're trying to understand the contemporary world. Anyone who's ever taken a class with me before is very familiar with my excessive use of scare quotes, because I was hoping to demonstrate the way that all of these concepts are much more complicated than we tend to assume in our popular use of them. In any case, I'd like to briefly turn the camera over, the microphone, whatever. I'm going to turn the hosting duties over to Shauna briefly. Shauna is going to give a brief introduction to our program, and then it'll come back to me, and I'll introduce each of the presenters individually. So just as a bit of background, Shauna is the interim director of the College of Humanities, who specializes in biblical studies with a focus on history and the religions of Israel and the ancient Near East. So take it away, Shauna.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everyone. It has been my pleasure and my privilege to be acting director of the College of the Humanities this year. It has been a challenging year. One of the things that the college has tried to sustain has been our commitment to making our scholarship accessible to the wider community within and outside of Carleton. And our religion program has been doing an excellent job of that, as tonight's events will demonstrate. In addition to our undergraduate program in religion, we have a Master of Arts program, and the focus of that program is on religion and public life. People often overlook a religion program or think that we're somehow devotional or confessional or philosophical in terms of what we spend our time teaching and researching. So when something like the downtown trucker convoy happens, and it happens right here in our own backyard with such overtly religious language and ideology expressed as unifying and underlying much of the protest, we wanted to kind of seize the moment to demonstrate exactly what the study of religion and public life is all about. This is religion and public life. The ways in which religion permeates so much of our lives, our politics, our social structures, our worldviews, are plenty and evident in everything we all do every day, but usually religion flies below the radar, and it isn't so overt and in our faces that people other than religion professors think to remark on it or to analyze or discuss it. In the case of the recent protests, religious rhetoric has been front and center, right in our faces. And my colleagues here tonight, Professors Geisinger, Wolford, Pettipies, and Dick, all have some very thoughtful and interesting ways of understanding this. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome the panelists and to welcome the audience and to open up the roundtable discussion. And Professor Chris Jensen will be moderating, so I will hand the virtual microphone back to him.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Shauna. And also, one final thank you. I would just like to express our tremendous appreciation to Nick Ward and the team at the Fast Communications office. We had been talking about this event on and off for a few days, but they really helped us to put this event together at a breakneck pace, and I'm very glad that it was able to work out as it did. So with no further ado, I would like to turn things over to Professor Ash Geisinger. So Ash is the graduate coordinator of our Religion and Public Life MA program, and their research concentration is in classical Quranic exegesis and Muslim intellectual history. But as a result of teaching graduate courses, has also, I would say, developed a new research interest in religion as currently practiced in the contemporary world, and in particular in the Canadian context. So with no further ado, Dr. Geisinger. Oh, and you're muted.
By now, I should know how to use Zoom. Welcome, everybody, to our program. So to begin, we should consider why religion and public life matters. For those of us who are in this field, we get asked this fairly regularly. So religion is, and public life, is the study of religion at the intersections of the social and the political. And when you think about it, almost every aspect of religion has a public life dimension in one way or another. Even apparently personal or individual religious beliefs or practices are also related in some way or another to public life. They're learned, they're passed on to others or not. They're shaped in multiple ways by community expectations, whether by conformity to those expectations, resistance against them, or something in the middle. So in our program, we have a number of core faculty with a wide variety of expertise and interests in various subfields in the study of religion. So we have different interpretive approaches, different specializations. Among the many things that my colleagues research include religion and politics, communal identities, how these are formed and contested, political theologies, religion and violence, religion and the law, religion, sexuality and gender, apocalyptic thinking, and the list goes on. So there are many ways in which religion and public life intersect, and our program can accommodate a wide range of interests and research topics that go far beyond what might come to mind when you think of religion and public life, issues of public policy. We go far beyond that. So our program is a 12-month, 3-term program for fall, winter, and summer. There are multiple entry possibilities. Some students are religion majors, others come from cognate disciplines or even from disciplines which are not cognate. Some of our students go on to do further graduate work, others go into various other occupations. And so we have both domestic and international students. All are welcome. If anyone has any more questions or things that they would like to know about our program, we do have a web page. You're also free to contact myself or Professor Dolansky at any time, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Okay, so to segue from that into a very good example, a trying one for us Ottawans, but anyway, of religion and public life in action, the 2022 Convoy protests. So these remarks of mine are definitely preliminary. We're still in the aftermath of the protests. And there are many issues to consider and to work through. Sorry, we are, oh heavens. Technical difficulties. No, definitely not. Come on. It will not cooperate. Yes, it will. No, it won't. My apologies. Okay, so very preliminary. Start with this picture. Like, this is the front gate of Parliament. Think about the symbolism of this and the many questions that it automatically raises. So from the onset, the 2022 Convoy protest in Ottawa was a complex event which demanded the attention of Ottawans, willing or not, most notoriously in terms of sound, the horn honking, but also visually. Much of the time, there was a lot going on visually as well as sound-wise in front of Parliament Hill, as well as in adjacent areas. And among the sights and sounds were explicit invocations of religious beliefs and religious texts, as well as religious practices. And this was the case from the beginning. Among the many flags, symbols, and signs displayed by the convoy on January 28th, on Friday, when it arrived at Parliament Hill, were signs explicitly invoking religious ideas such as God and faith, faith over fear. So this was a slogan that we might remember from last year's anti-lockdown protests as well. God's given immunity works best. God keep our land glorious and free, a line from our national anthem. But also note the reference to choice on the sign in the foreground. More on that in a moment. At mid-afternoon on that day on Parliament Hill, one could not only see these signs and others like them, but hear a preacher with a megaphone quoting from the Gospel of John as he urged people to repent so that God would heal our land. So there he's quoting 2 Chronicles verse 12 in chapter 7. As Christine Mitchell of University of Saskatchewan has pointed out, this verse's presence at the convoy protest signals the influence of white Christian nationalism. This verse would make other appearances at various points during the 3-week long protest. Here it is tied to the fence in front of Parliament Hill, as would a number of other biblical verses and other invocations of religious ideas, whether displayed on trucks, quoted by preachers on Wellington Street, or written on placards and fastened to the fence in front of Parliament. What to make of such mostly Protestant and often evangelically flavored religious expressions? What role did they play in the protests? And what does examining these add to our understanding of this event? There are a number of possible ways that these questions could be approached. In these few minutes, I will focus on their roles and the protesters' claims of their entitlement to space, and in their efforts to embody their demands in order to enact change. To begin with claims to space, the area in front of Parliament is prime real estate on both practical and symbolic levels. From a practical standpoint, the presence of the protesters there could neither be ignored by the federal government nor by Ottawans, especially those living or working in the downtown, whose lives, and in some cases livelihoods, were seriously disrupted in multiple ways. On a symbolic level, to occupy and control that space, to render it beyond the rule of law, dramatically relegates authorities such as police and governments to irrelevance. Nor were such claims to space limited to that stretch of Wellington Street. Various actions of the protesters made their presence forcibly felt to varying extents over a significantly more extensive part of the downtown. These claims to space by the protesters were a means to voice an array of shifting demands and at the same time to embody and enact them. Religious signs and symbols were instrumentalized in several key ways. They were part of the voicing of demands. They bolstered some protesters' self-positioning of their claims to an unchallengeable rightness, and they ramped up the polarizing rhetoric in ways that seemed to preclude compromise and arguably to possibly open space for violent action. As many have already pointed out, such entitlement to space has not historically been equally available to everyone in Canada, nor is it at present. That most of the demonstrators were white, of Christian heritage, and had aligned themselves with right-wing views was key to enabling them to assert such entitlement and to wrap themselves in the flag, figuratively as well as literally, through their effective deployment of national symbols. Not only the flag, but the national anthem, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and after a rough start, the National War Memorial in service of their cause. Was God keep our land glorious and free an expression of patriotism or an invocation of a religious idea? In the context of the protests, I would say that overall it functioned as either and both, addressing different audiences while fusing Canadianness with white Christian nationalism and presenting this fusion as natural and unproblematic. This was part of the protesters' self-representation of themselves as the voice of quote-unquote real Canadians who must therefore be heard. A number of signs displayed on vehicles carried by protesters and fastened to the fence in front of Parliament at various points during the protest quoted a variety of biblical verses. Overall, certain themes emerged repeatedly. The celebration of freedom and truth along with faith. So here we have freedom celebrated here. This is only one such verse that did that. And the assertion of binary opposites. We've got binary opposites in spades here too. So freedom as opposed to slavery, as in the verse here, Galatians 5:1. Faith as opposed to fear. We've already seen that on a sign. And fear is also set in opposition to love in some of the signs. Good as opposed to evil. Freedom and truth are linked in some of the signs. The truth sets you free, as in John 8:32. Here we don't have the verse citation, just attributed to Jesus. The opposition of freedom in this context, it is implied free from COVID mandates, to slavery, implied being subject to such health measures, communicated much the same message as the other numerous signs with slogans such as coercion is not consent, and even my body, my choice. Choice and consent rhetoric is appropriated here in order to voice deep concerns about the direction of the nation, whether these concerns are government overreach, fears of an impending slide into autocracy, or an allusion to conspiracy theories about vaccines, the pandemic, the pharmaceutical industry, or who is actually in control of the government. The repeated invocations of truth and its links to being free also apparently allude to such conspiracy theories. And there were many signs around Parliament Hill and elsewhere in the protests that referenced particular conspiracy theories of this type. The implication that the protesters are on the side of God, the good, battling against the forces of evil, expressed in part through biblical verses variously calling for believers to quote unquote put on the armor of God, Ephesians 6:11, and to stand up against the evildoers, Psalm 94 verse 16a, can be understood as a way to address uncertainty and fear. By asserting such stark binaries, the urgency of putting the country back in order, quote unquote, is underlined. But such binary oppositions left little space for shades of gray or conceding that one might be mistaken. While a few signs appeared to Prime Minister Trudeau to repent, on the other hand, we have this type of threatening sign here. I'm not sure what to make of the extra E, whether this is a spelling mistake or intended as a gendered slur. There were also signs, a few of them, calling on him to repent, quote unquote. So signs calling on him to repent apparently hold out hope that he might reconsider his stand on COVID measures. But the very framing, asking him to repent, positions him as sinful if he does not do so, while affirming that in any case, the protesters are unquestionably in the right and empowered also to sit in judgment over him and over the government. But whatever the Prime Minister or other levels of government might or might not do, the protesters had enacted and embodied freedom already through their repeated actions in defiance of the law, ranging from their refusal to follow COVID protocols, causing some businesses to close, to their ear-splitting, horn-honking, and harassment of mask-wearing locals. And their invocation of such biblical texts underwrote, in their view, their right and even their duty to do so. So here's a verse that is being pressed into service to comment on the rightness of honking the horns. And this was I saw it on February 6th, and this was just when the injunction against the horn honking was on the brink of going through. So here we have a scriptural quotation being used to comment on and to counter what was actually going on the ground. So there is a lot more that I could say about this, but as far as preliminary remarks are concerned, this is sufficient. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Ash. I would next like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Johannes Wolford. So Johannes has been teaching at Carleton since 2007 and has been a fixture of the RPL program, our MA program, since its inception. His research interests include early modern Christianity and understandings of historiography, as well as the broad topic of religion and violence. So with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Johannes.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Ash, and thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Can you all hear me well? Well enough? Okay. So I call this Notes Towards an Account of the Ottawa Occupation in Terms of Religious History and Public Life. And I have 4 or 5 items, depending on how the time goes. And Chris, please feel free to cut me off when I hit 10 minutes. So I'll start with the first, which is the setup. Political relations don't just exist. They are enacted or performed at various sites in diverse social locales. For instance, formal politics are enacted within institutional settings, such as governments, government bodies, the offices of elected officials, the police, the courts, and so forth, according to explicit rules. Informal politics happen outside of institutional settings, in space sometimes generically called the street, and are performed in accordance with what one giant in the field of resistance studies, J.C. Scott, has termed hidden transcripts. The point of either kind of political performance is to conjure and assert power by projecting legitimacy both to oneself and to others. Over the course of several centuries now, the formal politics of our institutions have increasingly been styled secular in their claims to legitimacy. Thus, when and where informal politics have also functioned as counter-politics, they have often drawn on resources abandoned by or excluded from formal politics as inappropriately religious. Again, J.C. Scott coined a memorable term, weapons of the weak. So I'm going to argue that weapons, in this case, religious resources have been attractive, particularly because they serve as a weapon of the weak. More than that, though, this evening I want to suggest how a story connecting religion to public action and associated with the Reformation of the 16th century may have been an important part of the informal politics of the Ottawa occupation. I will conclude that apparent similarities between 2 unfolding movements are not just coincidental or imagined, that is imagined by myself, but represent actual historical connections mediated as hidden transcript. Some Ottawa occupiers were keenly aware of such connections. Others may not have been, but were swept up in the movement nonetheless as religious actors, if not fervent believers. My point finally is to steer us away a little bit from the circular logic that simply has some protesters inspired by religion or religious belief. Instead, I want to suggest that the Ottawa occupation entailed practices of relating religious militancy and activism to public life, and that these were homegrown practices, homegrown in the dirt of Canadian settlement history, an emphasis on settlement. 2, the story. On January 5th, 1534, that date is the eve of Epiphany, which is what J6 used to be called. A group of self-described evangelical or Bible-adhering Christians and practitioners of adult baptism took over the city of Münster in Westphalia near the present German-Dutch border. Some were local, but others had arrived there from all over the German-speaking lands in the Low Countries, following an established practice or established practices of both pilgrimage and lending aid or sending relief of which a special combination instance was called war pilgrimage, or more commonly known as crusade. That may sound familiar. The Munsterites argued that the law of the former magistrates had been superseded by another law, one of biblical constitution, because the magistrates had become spiritually corrupt, which made them tyrants. While in theory all were subject to the same authority of God, practically speaking, the Munsterites constituted a self-anointed religious and self-appointed political authority. Again, that might sound familiar. Many who journeyed to Münster brought with them their families and some supplies and settled in for the long haul, assaying and allocating resources, distributing key tasks and appointing community officers, and so forth. They set up an alternative government while the established municipal authorities either joined in, faded from view, or actually fled the city. In all cases, leaving the occupiers effectively in control. Again, it may sound familiar. Many of the Munsterites had experience in policing early modern style as part of their own community's burger watches. Some had actual military experience, including during the so-called Peasants' War of 1525 or 26. These experiences clearly influenced their pragmatic approach to establishing a pure state within a corrupt state. For a while, the occupiers were well supported and supplied, and a kind of carnivalesque atmosphere reigned within the city, which attracted further supporters. Then, elation gave way to desperation as supplies dwindled and the business of managing their impromptu kingdom became increasingly complex and challenging. Eventually, various super-regional governments mounted an opposition to the occupiers, canvassing support throughout the land for a counter-crusade, a process that entailed lurid propaganda ranging from the scatological to charges of gluttony, sexual license, and child abuse. Other jurisdictions sent militias or money for mercenaries who laid siege to Münster, and so slowly and inevitably overcame the occupiers. The key stated aim of this campaign, or the key stated dual aims of this campaign, were to take back the city and to restore order. Still, prominent leaders were subjected to special legal proceedings and, famously, to extraordinary punishments, and so went down in history as infamous villains to some and heroes or martyrs to others. 3, some broader frameworks. So the preceding occupation story displays both some differences, but also many striking similarities to Ottawa 2022. And of course, I've selected some of the highlights for the similarities, and I won't make any bones about that. But I'm especially trying to draw attention to the similarities in the practices of both the occupiers and their opponents, how they related to each other in their behaviors, but also in that complex of political and theological ideas, which scholars commonly call Christian resistance theory. Yet cultural practices and ideas don't really travel without or apart from social relations and other human interactions to sustain them. Therefore, one might also expect to see some further similarities between our two cases, conjunctural ones. And I'll just highlight a few of those. The early modern German economy was heavily reliant both on agricultural production and on resource extraction, and especially the latter was tied to emerging market economies on a global scale. And you might know, or you might recall from some course, some point, or something you've read, that Martin Luther came from a mining family in a mining region, and that his famous hour of spiritual crisis took him in prayer to Saint Anne, the patron saint of miners. It's really just an aside. Prior to 1534, many aspects of the German economy had been disrupted by 1, climate crisis leading to crop failures, famine, and epidemic disease. Sound familiar? 2, cheaper alternatives to local resource extraction, namely plundering the Americas. Commodity shortages plus an oversupply of money metals, stolen again from Central and South America, led to inflation throughout Germany, which was a disaster for wage earners in all sectors, but especially on that cusp of rural and urban existence, which was so important in the early modern period. And that's basically a trajectory we've been on ever since. One of the reasons we know so much about this, it's my third point here, is that the then new and largely unregulated medium of print was used to allow grievance lists and manifestos, one sheet usually, to circulate like wildfire. It also afforded a burgeoning market for salacious narrative reports of crises or disasters of all sorts, including the occupation and relief of Münster. In other words, new media, early modern style, also played a part. Of course, the new medium of print also had broadcast influential religious political tracts, such as Luther's On the Freedom of a Christian Man, 1520, and Luther's On Secular Authority, To What Extent It Should Be Obeyed, 1523. And if you follow some of the threads that Professor Geisinger already sort of teased out, if you look at the way some of those scriptural texts get used, very quickly, surfing the internet, you will find versions of those texts on secular authority or on the freedom of a Christian man that are still being used to inform the exegesis of those texts in certain ways. That's by the way. But to sum up, early modern Germany was a time of great social, cultural transformation, dislocation, accompanied by great religious political ferment. Okay, fourth, legacies. The story of Münster and of other similar episodes of the Reformation have long been enlisted for both right-wing and left-wing politics as fables, morality tales, templates, or guides, and usually with a very heavy emphasis on the role of charismatic prophetic leaders, of which I'm going to say very little tonight. Instead, my purpose is to ask questions about the followers, those who escaped immediate arrest and punishment and left Münster, went on to other places, and about their descendants. Especially, I want to ask about their descendants. What happened to them? Where did they go? Where are they now? Well, a surprising number of them eventually came by very circuitous routes. Baptists in Manitoba, for instance, where the Dominion government actually granted them reserves. Others came to Southern Ontario and BC in several waves of so-called neo-Calvinists who identified with that 16th century reformers' legacy, but were more directly followers of a man named Abraham Kuyper, a key figure in the development of Christian nationalism, especially Boer Christian nationalism, and thus eventually apartheid in South Africa. Conservative and traditionalist Lutherans settled in large numbers in Southern Ontario and across the prairies, and smaller numbers, but nonetheless coherent communities of all of these groups can today be found in and around Ottawa. They are all a key ingredient in Canadian evangelical culture, especially the determination with which they maintain a sense of their Reformation heritage. By contrast, other evangelical Christian communities in Canada don't base their identities, individual or collective, in such histories. For example, members of so-called AICs, or African Initiated Churches, Caribbean diaspora churches, Brazilian or Filipino Pentecostal charismatic churches place little to no emphasis on early modern European history. Not surprisingly, these latter groups were not much in evidence during the occupation of Ottawa, at least not as far as I could see, and perhaps Professor Geisinger could help me with this. What was in evidence, though, were groups of white folks singing Martin Luther's famous hymn, the original evangelical fight song, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Fifth, a parting shot. The Ottawa occupation was hardly a spontaneous or chaotic rupture in Canadian history or a departure from political tradition writ large. While many people watched the occupiers coming from a long distance, one could have seen them coming from a long time away too. But to see how 16th century European religious history might erupt at any time into our 21st century civic space, one must also appreciate traditions of informal politics and their hidden transcripts. For that, one could do worse than to study religion and public life. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Johannes. And that was right on the money at 10 minutes, so nicely done. Next, I'd like to turn the mic over to Dr. Tim Pettipies. Tim's an assistant professor in the College of Humanities. He's studied Coptic Manichaean literature and is interested in multidisciplinary approaches to the study of religion, religious cultures in late antiquity. But has also developed a recent interest in the reception of religion and the way that ancient religious trends are represented in contemporary media. And I believe that's the theme that he's going to be talking about tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Great, thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this interesting program tonight with several of my colleagues. Just going to share my screen here. Now, what I'd like to try to do is to put things two things really, to put events that have been discussed so far in a broader contemporary context, as well as making connections, especially to earlier periods in Christian history, much as Professor Wolford has already done. Now, I'd like to start by saying that in spite of proclamations heard in many quarters about the post-religious and secular nature of modern society, nearly every major geopolitical crisis of the early 20th century has been in some way enveloped in religious discourse. Religion is by no means the only factor in these events. There are, of course, social, political, economic forces at play. But religious rhetoric has been a common element both in how these events are expressed as well as how they are interpreted, at least in certain quarters. Most recently, we see religious discourse embedded in some widely held conspiracy theories. Professor Geisinger already made allusion to some of these. In particular, the QAnon phenomenon, which is a complex web of claims about a global child sex trafficking ring managed by liberal elites and the efforts of Christian conservatives to wage a clandestine war against it. During the pandemic, QAnon ideas have intertwined with anti-vax ideology and wellness culture, in that COVID is viewed somewhat paradoxically as either a hoax or a mass medical experiment, whereby the same shadowy liberal elites might control the population via technology implanted through vaccines. Even the current crisis unfolding in Ukraine is being woven into the conspiracy macro narrative, as were the Ottawa Convoy protests of a few weeks ago. So as a scholar of religion and as someone who's interested in the history of religion, I'm looking to identify some historical patterns that these movements represent, since in my view, many of them contain what I would call well-established apocalyptic themes. So that's what I want to focus on. Now, Christianity in general has exhibited a strong apocalyptic tendency since its beginnings. Apocalyptic imagery and themes are built into its scripture-based discourse, which is in large part drawn from biblical texts such as the Apocalypse of John or Book of Revelations, as it's sometimes known. These images and themes often self-replicate in times of transition or crisis. As such, it is no surprise that we are seeing many of these elements today. So what I would like to do is go over some of the key features of the apocalyptic worldview, and this will provide an opportunity, an additional opportunity, to see how the academic study of religion can be applied to current day events. Now, first, one of the most important things I think to understand about the Christian view of history is that it is eschatological and God-driven. Events in the world are understood to be overseen by a higher power. Therefore, principles derived from the Bible are thought to override government directives and laws. As such, as we've already seen evidence of in previous presentations, placards with Bible verses are often seen at political rallies involving QAnon, as they were in the Convoy protests. Second, apocalyptic movements also see the world in crisis and at a moment of transformation divine intervention, or in a day of judgment, or coming day of judgment. In the case of QAnon language, this is known as the Great Awakening or the Storm. And these slogans are often used at rallies and in sort of public displays. As a result of these base assumptions, social, political, and cultural events are seen as religiously meaningful, as signs of the times. This too is rooted in scripture and Christian scriptural tradition. So a political campaign is not just a political campaign, a vaccine is not just a vaccine, a war is not just a war. Members of apocalyptic movements view the world dualistically, since the transitional crisis playing out before them is thought to reflect a cosmic struggle between forces of good and evil. Political, social, or cultural opponents are often described as demonic, or in QAnon terms, the white hats versus the black hats. This means that the powers that be, whether they are real or imagined, are usually understood as evil or malevolent agents, and this includes politicians, global financial institutions, Hollywood actors. There is also what I would call a strong Gnostic element, since only members of the group possess special knowledge about the true nature of reality. Professor Geisinger touched on this notion, this notion of the idea of truth in these manifestations. Only insiders know what's really going on. We see this in the rhetoric about the deep state, the danger of vaccines, or in some more extreme forms, claims about secret subterranean warfare between the white hats and the black hats. Outsiders in the general public are described as sheeple by QAnon adherents, willfully ignorant bystanders. Apocalyptic discourse also makes extensive use of coded language and symbolism for insiders, Bible verses, iconography, pop culture references. In the case of QAnon slogans, examples would be where we go one, we go all, enjoy the show, references to the red pill. This reinforces group solidarity. Apocalyptic movements also tend to rally around messianic figures, self-appointed prophets and apostles. For example, Donald Trump was increasingly viewed in messianic terms by QAnon adherents. And closer to home, in the context of the Convoy protests, organizer James Bowder stated to a CBC reporter that God had directed him through prayer to initially begin the convoy. Meanwhile, another organizer, Tamara Leach, her husband told the court during her initial bail hearing that the Holy Spirit had guided him to Ottawa. So at nearly every level, we see religious language and discourse being implicated in these events. Finally, the apocalyptic group or community often feels it is persecuted by the demonic powers that be, which only serves to reinforce their convictions, while some state their willingness to suffer and die in service for the cause, to hold the line, as it were. And this can historically lead to violence and tragic outcomes. Now, briefly, a few more factors that I think it's important to consider is that as perplexing as some of these conspiracy theories and religious rhetoric is to outsiders, this sort of apocalyptic discourse provides people with an interpretive framework or hermeneutic, as we say in religious studies, for understanding complex world events. At the same time, we should recognize that they are hugely amplified by social media, even though they represent a minority view and one that is often outside of established religious traditions. And I think in its current form, the apocalyptic rhetoric is fairly decentralized and organic, it is perhaps better to understand it as a cluster of overlapping discourses rather than a unified theory. It is also interdenominational and even interreligious, although mostly Christian, although many of its promoters appear to be non-institutional actors or religious freelancers who operate out of their own self-generated religious authority. Some of them might simply be trolls. Now, in the end, I think we should keep in mind that as complex, eclectic, and all-encompassing as this current wave of apocalyptic rhetoric is, it does not come from nowhere. It is entirely consistent with past trajectories of Christian discourse and completely comprehensible in historical perspective, as also Professor Wolford pointed out by looking at Reformation parallels. So that's all for my remarks. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. And with that, I can now turn to our last formal presenter of the evening, Hannah Dick. Now, before I introduce Hannah, I would just like to note that no one has written any questions yet. That's fine, no pressure, but it will be easier for me to do my moderating job if I'm not having to read all of the questions at once everyone is done talking. So if any questions have occurred to you, I would encourage you to start typing them into the QA dialogue now so that I can start compiling and synthesizing. Thank you. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Hannah Dick. Hannah is an assistant professor of communication and media studies in Carleton's School of Journalism and Communication. Her research focuses on the ways that legal and political discourse are shaped by religion. And she's currently working on a SSHRC-funded project entitled Christian Persecution at the Courts, which considers the role of conservative Christian advocacy in reframing discourses around civil rights. So obviously, perfectly situated to comment on these issues. So with that, I'll turn things over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Chris. So I'm just going to share my screen. So first of all, thank you so much to the organizers of this event and the program in Religion and Public Life for including me in this really important roundtable. So as the representative from Communication and Media Studies, of course, it's my professional obligation to use slides while I'm talking. And I'll just let you know at the outset that I'm going to be using several images from the Convoy, as well as some screenshots from affiliated social media accounts that do include some upsetting material. All right, so following the arrest of Convoy organizer Tamar Leach, her husband Dwayne invoked the, quote, First Amendment right to protest during her arraignment hearing. Other Convoy supporters echoed this First Amendment language, along with reported complaints that protesters were not being read their Miranda rights during arrest. Although it seems like most of these complaints actually came from American accounts. Of course, neither the First Amendment nor Miranda rights apply in the Canadian context. And law and legal studies scholars were quick to point out that the Charter is much more restrained in its articulation of individual freedoms than the American Bill of Rights. So there's certainly a story here about the influence of American police procedurals in misinforming Canadian understandings of rights and freedoms, as well as a clear need for broader and better civics education in Canada. But aside from providing a kind of much needed moment of levity amidst the tense police action to clear the convoy from the city center, I want to suggest that these invocations of American rights can also tell us something important about the transnational diffusion of rights-based discourses that inform a general politics of resentment. So these discourses are both highly specific to the American context, yet highly flexible and portable, lending both political and existential legitimacy to anti-statist organizing here in Canada. So to be clear, I don't mean to suggest that the convoy reflects a simple importation of American conservative Christian organizing into the Canadian context, nor to downplay the specific articulations of white Christian nationalism that take shape here, in which we've already heard about in some of the other talks. But it's also impossible to ignore the influx of American funding that supported the convoy on both the GoFundMe and GiveSendGo platforms, or the pervasiveness of American symbols that circulated throughout the city, from the Confederate and Gadsden flags to the proliferation of visual and rhetorical references to Trump. So these images and convoy participants' own invocation of American rights can tell us something about how Canadian right-wing populist discourses derive coherence in part from American political communication. And this seems to me to stand in stark contrast to another Canadian tendency, which is to frame our political sphere in negative relation to American politics. So in the process of adopting American symbols and discourses, the convoy both taps into a very familiar regime of representation and remakes it in highly Canadian fashion. So I'm thinking here of the image that you can see in the top left-hand corner of the screen of the Confederate flag that's been overlaid with a convoy truck at its center. There's a whole media studies project to be done here about the graphic design of convoy media. So in my remarks today, I want to briefly describe two components of American rights discourse that I see lending political and existential stakes to what happened here in Ottawa. So this is an outgrowth of my research into American conservative Christian political and legal advocacy work. And this advocacy frequently positions religious freedom against expanding civil rights. So first, American rights discourse has been premised on a highly individualized and increasingly neoliberal conception of religious freedom. And second, much of this rhetoric derives existential grounding from the language of Christian persecution. So I want to talk about each of these and suggest some links with the convoy more as a provocation or a speculation than as a final reading or analysis, as I think we're still in the preliminary stages of unpacking the kind of complex cultural politics at work here. So by individual neoliberal religious freedom rights, I mean the suggestion that mandates of any kind are construed as hostile forms of government overreach. Meanwhile, collectivist attempts to secure anti-discrimination protections on the basis of identity categories like race, gender, or orientation are often supplementary and require specific accommodation requests. Under the framework of the First Amendment, this discourse also asserts that both religious freedom and free speech, both of which are included in the First Amendment, are preeminent, not only historically or chronologically, but also legally, even though what is now the First Amendment was originally third in the list submitted to the states for ratification. So conservative Christian advocacy groups have been particularly effective at reframing religious freedom in more narrow terms, applicable almost exclusively to Christian institutions. During the 1970s and 80s, the political lobbying group known as the Moral Majority used this rhetorical device in order to advocate for the autonomy of Christian schools that continued to practice racial segregation in the wake of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. More recently, both free speech rights and religious freedom rights have been gradually extended to corporate entities in the US, as in the Supreme Court decisions in Citizens United and Hobby Lobby. And Christian law firms, including Alliance Defending Freedom, which represented the Christian baker who refused to create a specialty wedding cake for a same-sex couple, have used both free speech and religious freedom arguments in order to legitimize service denials. So both free speech and religious freedom are often intertwined in these arguments. So all these examples suggest a gradual widening of the space of exemption from anti-discrimination law and a more absolutist understanding of individual rights than we see in the Charter. So for this reason, I think it's important to develop a more precise understanding of the exact rhetoric of freedom invoked by convoy participants, with some significant parallels here between anti-discrimination law and public health mandates, which both get construed as hostile forms of government overreach, or as you can see in this image, coercion. So an absolutist understanding of individual rights also obscures the specific cultural politics that are at work in different articulations of freedom. So here I'm invoking Lisa Dugan's work on the cultural politics of liberalism and neoliberalism, both of which she argues, quote, organize material and political life in terms of race, gender, and sexuality, as well as economic class and nationality or ethnicity and religion. So in this respect, I argue that the call to, quote, restore the rights and freedoms of all Canadians, as you can see in one of the Convoy's open letters from February 17th, is not a call for deregulatory measures, but rather an argument in favor of a very specific reorganization of social and public space on behalf of a narrow conception of freedom that derives legibility from preeminent understandings of First Amendment freedom. We can see this in one example from the Convoy's official Facebook page here, which currently has over 384,000 followers. This post compares the packed SoFi Stadium during this year's Super Bowl with an image of police action to clear the Ambassador Bridge. And you can see the caption that accompanies the image describes the US as the land of the free, in contrast to the language of Canada's system of liberal governance. Now, there's also an interesting irony here, as SoFi's COVID regulations actually required masking along with proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test in order to gain admittance to the stadium. But read in this way, the calls to mandate freedom that circulated throughout Ottawa are not just an ironic repurposing of the language of vaccine mandates, but also reveal the fact that the version of freedom being called for invokes highly individualized notions of freedom over, say, the freedoms of vulnerable groups to access public spaces without fear of infection. So I argue that these are actually competing discourses of freedom, but the Convoy's leveraging of the term drew in part on deregulatory language that has been quite popular in the US. Okay, this brings me to the second discursive formation that I think we need to pay attention to, and this follows really nicely from Tim's talk. This is the articulation of a generalized sentiment of Christian persecution, which informs a lot of rights discourse. So I'm drawing here on Candida Moss's work on early Christian martyrology and Elizabeth Castelli's discussion of Christian persecution, which she argues comes out of this early church memory work. So this defensive discourse positions Christians as eternally at odds with the world, invoking New Testament understandings of the righteous suffering of Jesus, early Christian narratives around martyrdom and self-sacrifice, and often involves appropriating the victimization rhetoric of American civil rights campaigns, as well as other historically marginalized groups. So in the image you can see here, you can see the reference to the parting of the Red Sea and the liberation of the Jewish people from Egypt as appropriated by the Convoy movement on their official website. And I'm not an expert on the Torah, but I'm pretty sure that the enormous sharks are a later addition. They really sort of add to the theological stakes here. Political scientist Alison M. Cole argues that American conservative political communication traffics in what she calls the cult of true victimhood, in which the suffering of minority groups is called out as performative, while the backlash received by those who discriminate against those groups is understood to circumscribe authentic suffering. So I also suggest that we need to distinguish between different invocations of victimhood and attend especially to the discursive appropriation of suffering by historically majoritarian groups. So Christian persecution discourse is marked with a tension here. Its invocation requires the language of majoritarian support, the idea of a silent majority, but minoritarian positioning. And the theological grounding of the discourse lends it particular existential weight. So an example from the Convoy here, there were various reports of sightings of the Star of David throughout the city, including one report in the Ottawa Citizen that a booth set up on Wellington was distributing these to Convoy participants. One of the origin points for this iconography can be found on the Instagram page of Kimberly Newdorf. This is the Almer woman who organized 2 so-called freedom marches in the fall of 2020 to protest public health mandates. So you can see a couple of images from her Instagram page here, and the appropriation of the visual rhetoric of both the Holocaust as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. Newdorf also attended the Ottawa Convoy and posted on her Instagram page about her participation in the Jericho marches around Parliament Hill. So this is in reference to the American Jericho March movement, which was part of the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol, and it's where the iconography of marchers wielding Jewish shofars comes from. The rhetoric of Christian persecution also emerged in some interviews with Convoy participants, such as George Dick, featured in this article on CBC News. who described the enormous personal and economic sacrifices he was making in order to participate in the convoy. Quoted here in an interview with reporter Jorge Barrera, he said, "What did Jesus do? He gave it all. He gave everything." So to be clear, these are not distinctly American formations, nor were all convoy participants Christian. Even speaking in terms of the convoy as if it's a singular or homogeneous entity is disingenuous given the multiple constituencies involved. But the cross-border percolation of these discourses of rights, freedom, and persecution, I do think requires some closer attention. Understanding the complex cultural politics of the convoy means attending to the symbolic and linguistic networks that lend existential and political urgency to these movements. So I'm looking forward to chatting more about this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. And I'd like to take the opportunity now to just thank all of the presenters for their fascinating talks. And now we can turn things over to the Q&A. So I'd like to bring together a couple of themes that I've seen in a few questions already, with one question that came up for me as I was listening as well, because I think that's my prerogative as the MC, but we'll see. Hopefully no one's too upset about it. So my question is, for those of you who were directly involved with or came into direct contact with the protests, so Ash, for example, I know that you live right downtown, and so were immediately impacted by these events. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on the utility of a religion in public life perspective defined broadly when dealing in the way that you had to with religious or religion inflected phenomena that were impinging upon your life directly. And also whether this RPL perspective perhaps granted you an empathy that you might not have had otherwise. Now, this ties into a question that was asked by Colleen, who asked, does understanding the religion-based historical links of the convoy, so the past connections, for example, those that were discussed by Johannes, do these give us any specific suggestions as how to best deal with these types of protests in the present or in the future in terms of limiting the potential for violence or the chaos that is thereby caused? So that's sort of a nexus of questions, and maybe I'll start with Ash and just go one at a time across the presenters, see if anyone else has anything they'd like to add on that. So I'll turn it over to you, Ash, first.
When it first happened, I went up to see what was going on, well, partly because the racket wasn't allowing me to do anything else. Working from home under the convoy was interesting and far worse for people who lived closer to it. So there was that, but there was, I had anticipated that there might be some religion and public life connections going on because during the anti-lockdown protests last year, I had seen Trump flags as well as those faith over fear signs and so on, and was also aware of certain churches, so in Southern Ontario as well as in Manitoba and Alberta, which had been opposing vaccinations or COVID restrictions. So I figured there might be something, but I was quite overwhelmed by the amount. And while I could see some connections with some other protests that I've seen in Ottawa, so whenever there's a pride parade, back before COVID when we could have those physically, there would be some conservative Christian counter protests holding up Bible verses on signs, etc. But there was nothing on the scale of this at all. So yes, I was spending a lot of time just trying to understand what was going on and trying to make some sort of sense of it. So I found religion and public life was a useful framework to think about why are all these expressions of religion being displayed on Parliament Hill, and what is this doing for people, and how is it relating to other aspects of the protest that when I first encountered them, I thought, well, what does a hot tub have to do with Bible verses? Or, you know, I'm going among the crowds and I can smell weed and I can hear a preacher telling everyone to repent. Like, how does this all go together? And realizing that, yeah, as far as the people who are taking part are concerned, yes, there are elements that certain of them are not, you know, that they're focusing on elements which speak to them and ignoring other stuff. But also that they don't see it as contradictory. So yeah, I found religion and public life to be a helpful framework for thinking things through. As far as empathy is concerned, well, I was trying to be empathetic to many people, including my neighbors, and what they were going through. So I did notice grief on the part of especially some older people when they saw the way that the flag in particular, as well as the war memorial, was being used in these discourses, and that they were grieved. So I was also dealing with that.
All right, thanks. Anything else from Anna, Tim, or Johannes? If so, we can go in presenter order. You can just hold up your hand if you'd like to contribute. So, Johannes.
Well, I mean, the question you asked was a bunch of questions in one. So I just caught the end part, or that's what stuck with me, which was, you know, the question, knowing that there's a pattern here in a historical context that first of all produces pattern, and then reproduces the pattern. What is to be done in future? And you know, the correct answer, and it also sounds a little glib, is don't underestimate the force of these things. I think that was clearly something, and I do recall early in events, I had some email exchange with Ash, in which the question, where is this leading, came up, and that first started me thinking about, well, you know, are there ways of predicting this? And that's how I came to the idea of a hidden transcript that despite their own protestations, I think a lot of the people said, well, we don't know where this is going. We've just got to, you know, and we have no plan. And in fact, it makes no sense to have a plan because, let's face it, the world is ending. We've heard that before too. And so that had me thinking about plans and patterns. And you know, I don't think that they ever end well, but they end worse if they are allowed to really take hold, gather momentum, when the secular authorities, in Luther's term, are not prepared to intervene and act, because they're either convinced or simply overwhelmed by, let's say, the language of freedom, and they don't know how to break it down. They don't know how to disaggregate legitimate and illegitimate invocations of freedom and so on. So there's sort of a paralysis that set in. And I think people very quickly realized that was happening, but didn't know what to do once they were, you know, that's the problem with paralysis. You know, or night fright, you know it's happening and you can't act. And I would say, you know, having historical models, having reference points really helps with sort of giving you enabling action, giving you a capacity to act before it's too late. That was not very coherent, but.
That's great. Thank you, Johannes. Tim, Hannah, would you like? Okay, Tim.
Yeah, just building on what Johannes was saying, I'm not privy to what goes on behind closed doors at, say, CSIS or the RCMP or even Ottawa Police Service, but this sort of thing ought to be part of the kind of calculus of response. Maybe it is already, but I suspect it isn't really. Like many people, I was glued to I wasn't near the protests myself in the city, but I was glued to the live coverage and reporting through a number of media sources. And I can't think of a single time that anybody, there were all kinds of experts interviewed and lawyers and politicians and law enforcement people, but to my knowledge, not a single academic of religion was asked for commentary. The religious dimension is so obvious, I think, from all of the presentations tonight. And even the CBC online CBC article that was mentioned by Professor Dick, it was purely a kind of testimonial piece. There was no, you know, framework of commentary or contextualization at all. But that's, I guess, par for the course when religion is involved in public events.
Anna, had you had any reflections on this, or should we go to another question?
I can speak a little bit. I mean, just
Sure,
to echo what others have said, I'm thinking about, again, just to go back to the question of existential urgency. I think obviously thinking of the protest and trying to identify some of the religious elements, not just contemporary, but the deep historical currents that others were speaking to, is so important for understanding that urgency, and to be able to parse that in relationship to other kinds of protest movements, I think actually is quite important for responding to these kinds of movements. And then the other thing I'll just say is part of this is also about the, you know, at least in the American context, about the Christian right's ability to really develop a monopoly around the language of freedom. And I think, you know, the argument that I want to make is that we need to kind of reclaim that language of freedom to talk about civil rights, to talk about minority religious groups, to talk about other things that get completely left out of the language of freedom when it's used in such a narrow kind of way. So that's not a way to sort of diffuse a movement when it's already in action, but maybe a kind of political strategy moving forward.
All right, great. Thank you all for those responses. So another question has to do with discrepancies between or within religious groups. So I'm going to be combining a few questions together here, and we'll see how coherent I managed to make that. So one anonymous attendee noted a contrast between the ideology of the Convoy, talking about their freedom, versus the and often using language of the sort of greater good, etc., but obviously ignoring the negative effects that these actions would have on other people, right? Likewise, Noel, one of our colleagues, has also said, would anyone like to comment on the marked discrepancy between the positions on vaccines and lockdowns voiced by mainstream or mainline Christian denominations? For example, the Pope declared getting vaccinated was a moral obligation, and United and Anglican churches were happy to close or restrict attendance. So on one hand, you have the sort of mainline Christian approaches versus what he describes as the largely freelance religious actors who showed up on the Hill. So any comments on either of those issues, the sort of either incoherence or incompatibility between rights discourse and the foregrounding of religious rights over the rights of the ill, for example, or the mainline versus evangelical Christian question? Any comments on that? And you can just raise a hand and I will turn things over to anyone who would like to speak. Johannes, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just to Noel's comment, I mean, you know, there are lots and lots of different flavors, varieties of Christianity, and I'm not sure whether the right opposition or anti category to mainline is freelance. because that makes it sound like sort of, lone wolves, individual actors, people who are not part of a discourse. I would say it makes more sense to realize that there are traditions of non-hierocratic Christianity in which conscience inspired decision. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of talking about this, both emically and edically, where sort of non-conformity is the norm, if you like, and many of those are, not surprisingly, well represented in amongst groups of settlers in Canada, precisely because they didn't play well with others in early modern Europe, and we have to sort of, and I see sort of Sean McGuire's question in the same light. I think we have to realize the extent to which these groups are not just established in the United States under the cover of, let's say, the welcoming attitude of early governors of Pennsylvania, where, but also are very well represented and establish themselves very easily, and perhaps without assimilation pressure, cultural assimilation pressure that often existed south of the border in Canada. So when the question is, what's particular about the Canadian context, it's not unique to Canada, but in Canada in particular, some of these groups are able to maintain a very long tradition of thinking of themselves in terms of being a persecuted minority, in terms of being the only people who have the key, who know how to read the world as scripture correctly, and so on and so forth. So yeah, maybe I shouldn't put those two together, but I think that the traditions of Christian independence, and I'm dancing around, and Noel will recognize that I'm dancing around the R word, radical, because I don't want to talk about radical Reformation or radical Christianity. The traditions of non-hierocratic, decentralized Christianity are particularly well represented in Canada, and they maintain an identity without being assimilated to a larger evangelical soup in Canada, even better than they do in the United States.
Okay, would any of the three remaining panelists like to offer any additional comments on that question, or should we move on to another? You can just raise a hand if you're interested. Ash, go ahead.
You're muted.
Trying to unmute myself. Okay. No, I just wanted to suggest that some of the churches, at least, who have not had a problem conforming to COVID measures, have expressed a different idea of what freedom means. So, for example, the Presbyterian Church right downtown at Elgin and Laurier, well, Elgin and Lisgar, sorry, had a sign at the height of the protests out front saying, "Real freedom secures safety and health of others." So they have a tendency to put stuff on their signs that is a comment on current events. So in that regard, this was not unusual for them. But it does suggest a different idea of freedom that they're trying to stand alongside.
Any other comments, or shall we move on? Okay, so there's a whole constellation of questions that have come in that are essentially either saying, hey, has anyone looked into this? Or, yeah, actually, that's it. They're just saying that. Has anyone looked into this? How about this side, or this or that facet of the protest movement? So one such question, this one I guess predominantly be directed at Tim, is that there has been a general recognition that the QAnon conspiracy theory includes a lot of tropes from popular anti-Semitic discourse. And so one commenter was wondering whether there was any evidence of that particular flavor of anti-Semitism in the use of QAnon at this particular protest. Another question that was also just, hey, has anyone thought about this? Does anyone know if someone has looked into the explicitly Christian Give, Send, Go funding platform, and whether there's any particular significance in the use of that platform, or maybe even in that platform's usage guidelines that made it more more desirable or more efficacious for the convoy protesters? Any thoughts on either of those points? Tim, go ahead.
Yes, on the first issue, I mean, it's still early days. There's lots of things that need to be investigated, and as some of the other speakers have pointed out, the protests were such an eclectic mix of different currents and interests and constituencies that it's hard to kind of parse one out from the other. But one thing I did find particularly, and continue to find particularly puzzling, was the kind of simultaneous, both explicit and implicit, like racism and anti-Semitism in terms of symbolism and rhetoric of organizers, and the sort of images that were on display, but at the same time a kind of appropriation of symbolism, like the Star of David, or the constant comparisons to the Holocaust as a kind of victimhood identity, by the same kind of by the same sort of discourse that would also engage in conspiracies about a global order, that are very racist. So that's definitely something that needs to be unpacked further. But the whole phenomenon was such a kind of conglomeration of often contradictory elements. That is part of the challenge of making sense of it.
Thanks, Tim. Any other comments from the other panelists?
Just a comment that what Tim suggests needs to be parsed out, namely that sort of apparently contradictory mix of, well, in the early modern context, we would say virulent anti-Judaism and excited philo-Judaism. Those two coexist very, very clearly in the Reformation period, and especially in places that style themselves as New Jerusalem, right? And there's a long tradition of that in Christianity. So that doesn't, I mean, the sort of refiguring that in the high modern context in racial terms is an extra unfortunate twist, but that apparent contradiction and tension is there, and it is particularly marked in the early modern period.
Any other? Yes, Hannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just echo, the comments about, obviously so much of the anti-Semitic content of the convoy comes from the appropriation of the Holocaust iconography, right? And then we also saw the ubiquity of Nazi flags throughout the city, and then the claim that that's somehow a statement about, the persecuted status of convoy protesters. The problem with symbols like those is that you can't ensure their interpretation in that kind of way. And of course, you know, it doesn't really matter what you're intending. And that comparison in itself is kind of, it is anti-Semitic. I just want to comment on the Give, Send, Go thing, because this is a platform that's been really heavily used in the American political context. It provided a ton of funding to the insurrectionists at the US Capitol on January 6th. And at least what I saw in terms of, you know, that leak that exposed a lot of the donors, more than half of the donors on Give, Send, Go to the US or to the Ottawa convoy were actually located in the US. So tracking those circuits of funding is equally important to try to understand who's actually influencing what are, you know, obviously very Canadian formations around white Christian nationalism here.
Great, thank you. Here is another one of these, has anyone considered questions? This one from our colleague Melanie Coughlin, who asks, I'm generally interested in learning more about the use of religious rhetoric in the convoy to harden affect against marginalized groups. My premise, which needs to be explained because there's no coverage of this issue in media discourse around the convoy, is that both the premise and the means of the convoy were fundamentally ableist. To clarify, not only is the demand to remove COVID safeguards ableist, so were a variety of the means used, such as rocks thrown at paramedics, flood calls to 911, and life-threatening interference with in-home care supports for disabled people and elders living in the community. My interest in listening to your talks this evening is how religious discourse was used to increase the inordinate sense of the convoy members' own suffering as somehow greater than the suffering of other social groups. Are any of you including in your research specific links between ableist and religious rhetoric in the convoy? And I just wanted to read that out in its totality because I thought that was a really important question to consider. So do any of you have any comments on that? And Ash, please go ahead.
That's a really important point. Thank you for that. I know that there was some scattered media attention to issues of disability and the convoy, but nothing to my knowledge of how their rhetoric relates to their general either lack of care about the impact that they were having on many Ottawans, especially those who had various disabilities or who were otherwise marginalized, or even for those who offered a sort of, well, we know we're inflicting pain on people, but you know it's for the greater good, etc. Further picking apart of that. That, unfortunately, to my knowledge, didn't happen in the media. And it's a very important point. So thank you for that.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I also think that's a fantastic question. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I thought about something that's sort of tangential to that, because I was wondering about the conflation of, especially on the part of authorities in Ottawa early, either conflation or extension of the rights of the person to these massive trucks, right? So these sort of weird mobility rights that were extended, or the rights of presence on the hill extended to these trucks. And I was thinking about this sort of extraordinary potency, power, physical power of those trucks. And I would sort of be inclined to say that both the symbolism and the initial, and in practice, both on the part of the occupiers, but also on part of early response, was not just ableist, but was in a sort of very important way hyper ableist. And I think there was a way in which the early response was also informed by the idea that, well, this is a material physical power that we simply have to accede to. There was something very odd about the idea that you couldn't stop people from parking their trucks, driving their trucks wherever they wanted because of their individual rights, their human rights. So I would say that that question would open up a whole avenue, not just for documenting the experience up in the sort of the what is called the red zone, and the way in which some protesters went out of their way to cause harm and distress, but also the way that everybody initially responded to this as a not only a legitimate, but or I mean not necessarily legitimate, but sort of as a force that one had to accede to, and that one couldn't initially say no to. There was elsewhere, I think this has been covered under the rubric entitlement, but I would say that entitlement might also be framed as sort of hyper ableism and a sort of a performative hyper capacity. We're doing this because we can, and we're really going to do it because we really can. That's all.
All right, thanks, Johannes. Tim, Hannah, do either of you have any comments on that? No? Okay. So we've actually gone over time, and I'm trying to be sensitive to our tech, who is obviously working in the evening. So with all of that being said, I would just like to thank the panelists this evening, and to thank all of you who have taken some time out of your Thursday evening to come to this conversation with us. It's been our pleasure to be here with you, and apologies if we didn't get around to your questions, but yeah, thank you very much, and good night.